got the Austrian family tree up there, and the founder of Austrian economics is Karl Menger, 1840 to 1921. The generally accepted position on the Austrian school was that, of course, Menger was the founder. Eugen von Böhm-Bawerk was his most important student. Friedrich von Wieser, I'm putting him to the side as the brother-in-law of Böhm-Bawerk, contributed a little bit, but not a great deal. And then Mises, for I'm concerned, of course, is the great successor to Böhm-Bawerk. Story has been sort of changed, but revised in recent years, and revisionism can either be good or bad. It's never indifferent. You're either correcting the historical errors of the past, or else you're adding errors to previously accepted truth. What's been happening recently, I'll get back to this in a minute, what's been happening in the last 10 years or so with an explosion in Menger's study, which is all of the good, great stuff. For one thing, Menger didn't write very much. He wrote his great Principles of Economics in 1871. It was supposed to be volume 1 of a mighty treatise, which the rest of which never got published. This, by the way, just as an aside, the scholars of the subject don't write books entitled Part 1 or Volume 1, because often the other parts never get written. So this is what happened to Menger. He never completed this. It was supposed to be an introductory volume. Then he got off on methodology, his famous methodological struggle with Schmuller, and his famous article on the origin of money. And that's just about it. There were a couple of other things, but basically he didn't write too much more than that. With the explosion of Menger studies, the whole series of essays on Menger, and there will be more of that coming up, fortunately, because what happened was all of his papers were his lectures and papers and all that have been apparently under the custody of son Karl Menger Jr., distinguished mathematician, University of Chicago, who refused to allow anybody to see them. This is, of course, a mystery in itself. Why did he refuse to do this? Tied up, by the way, with the mystery of why Menger retired early at the age of 1903 from his chair and didn't do anything after that. Sort of retired and had his famous library, and that's about it. At any rate, the story is, I'm not sure if this might be apocryphal, and this is, I realize, a reporting rumor here, but it's interesting anyway. The story is that Karl Menger Jr. was haunted for all of his life by the fact that he was apparently an illegitimate son of the Karl Menger Sr., by a housekeeper. And in those days, of course, in Victorian Vienna, I don't know if I use that statement, this was a real shock and whatever, was swept under the rug. And apparently one of the reasons why Menger retired from his chair early in his life, or earlier, I think, he had to, and sort of because of this potential disgrace. Anyway, Karl Menger Jr. therefore refused to allow the papers. He's still at the age of 90 whenever he died. He still felt this terrible stain of illegitimacy. And apparently it was impossible to tell him that these days things are different. So he died a couple of years ago, and now the papers are at Duke University in the process of being cataloged and open to scholars. So we'll know more about Menger's ideas and where he stood on various things as time goes on. So whatever I say about Menger is going to be fairly tentative. But one of the problems with the explosion of interest in Menger is there's also an ideological drift connected with this hidden agenda in the accolades given to Menger, namely the depreciation and deprecation of Böhm-Bawerk. So as Menger has been lauded as the great founder of the Austrian School, which he was indeed, the achievements of Böhm-Bawerk have either been denigrated or forgotten and sort of stuffed away. And this is part of what I call the nihilist trend in modern Austrian movement. There's also a sort of an attempt to claim that Menger and Böhm-Bawerk were totally different, disagreed on almost everything and so forth and so on. I don't think that's true. I'm not prepared to state one way or the other. As I said, for one thing, the Menger papers have not been uncorked yet or studied. But I think this is the romantic story, and it is true, it's a true romantic story, is that Menger published his work in 1871 as a dramatic revolutionary, apparently in the German-speaking scene, and in general. And two young economists in their 20s, Wieser and Böhm-Bawerk, who were brothers-in-law, I'm not sure when they became brothers-in-law, like fairly early in the game, became Menger's great disciples, and eventually, both eventually taught at the University of Vienna after many years of teaching in other places. And they came to disagree fairly sharply. I think it's Wieser was certainly a praxeologist. He wrote on methodology in a sense, I think, more than Böhm-Bawerk did. But his basic view, he also contributed marginal utility theory and certainly opportunity cost theory. But basically, the whole rest of his approach, I think, was much more sort of neoclassical or pre-Keynesian. He did not believe, for example, in time structure of capital, as Böhm-Bawerk and Menger did. At any rate, the two of them, and this is Mises told me one time in a seminar, the two of them were brothers-in-law, very close friends, and they never discussed economics. Once they got to the point where they disagreed on stuff, they just never talked about it. They talked about the weather or what's going on in Vienna, the opera, and stuff like that. And they confined their arguments to the written page, where they lash out at each other in a polite but devastating manner. I think it's kind of a charming solution to a family question. Certainly, both of them thought of themselves as Mengerian disciples, as fulfilling and standing on the shoulders of Menger. He sort of drifted off in the methodology and not doing much. One of the interesting things about Menger, which by the way, I just found out fairly recently, is he was the tutor of Crown Prince Rudolf, the successor of the Austro-Hungarian throne, and sort of did with him apparently what he did with the Archbishop Fenelon did with the Duke of Burgundy back in the early 18th century France, late 17th century, early 18th century France. One of the problems here, I'm not sure what Menger's political economic views were. To me, it's unclear. According to the Barry Smith book, there's an article on Menger's political economy, and the Barry Smith book is an excellent compendium called Austrian Economics, a series of essays really on Austrian philosophy underlying Austrian economics. Anyways, there's an essay there on Menger's political philosophy, which sounds pretty grim. It's sort of very conservative, semi-statist, Austrian whatever. According to Erich Streissler, on the other hand, I just met with him a couple of weeks ago in Austria. He claims that Menger's lectures, it's clear from Menger's lectures, unpublished, of course, he was really a hardcore laissez-faire person. So I leave that up. I mean, I have no way to resolve this yet. Anyway, those are two views about Menger. And what the Meyerling approach was, apparently Menger tutored Crown Prince Rudolf in laissez-faire doctrine. Since Crown Prince Rudolf was the successor of the Austrian throne, the idea was he would then take over and impose classical liberalism or laissez-faire liberalism from above, so to speak. I mentioned Archbishop Fenelon because that was his plan of how to bring laissez-faire economics and politics to France. Here they were living in the absolutism of Louis XIV. It was sort of the epitome and apogee of absolutism and mercantilism and all the rest of it. And here's Archbishop Fenelon, who was a laissez-faire, anti-war, anti-militarist, everything, the whole rest of it. And what do you do about it? How do you convert the king? The idea of building a mass movement was considered bizarre. I don't think it was considered thinkable in late 17th century France. Previous mass movements have been wiped out by the French monarchy. What Archbishop Fenelon decided to do was get a hold of the crown prince, the Dauphin, who was going to be the Grand Dauphin, was the grandson of Louis XIV, was supposed to take over the throne of France and convert him if he was the Duke of Burgundy. And Archbishop Fenelon became the confessor and then the tutor of the Duke of Burgundy, and he formed what was called the Burgundy Circle, a whole group of people at the court, or the top laissez-faire scholars, historians, political philosophers, and economists in France, and worked on the Duke and converted him. So that by the time he grew up, he was totally dedicated to laissez-faire, eliminating all the status, eliminating the taxes, the controls, and all the rest of it, the whole structure of quasi-totalitarian statism Louis XIV had imposed. Well, unfortunately, what happened was about a year before he would have taken over the throne, he and his entire family were wiped out in the measles epidemic. This is it. The whole plan, a 25-year plan of converting the French monarchy, was out in dust. Poor Fenelon was, of course, in despair at this. I don't blame him. Well, that's one of the problems of this kind of strategy. If you rely on converting one prince or something, what do you do if the prince corks off? So essentially, the same thing happened apparently with Menger and Crown Prince Rudolf. There's also some Meyerling revisionism. Those of you who are interested in historical revisionism, this whole area, since again, I don't really know German, there's very little written on this in English. But apparently there's a whole wing of course, the Orthodox view, as you all know from the Charles Boyer picture or whatever, or later movies with the Archduke Rudolf committed suicide and killed his lover and whatever, in, I guess, 1889. There's other much more interesting revisionist views, one of which that he was committed suicide because he was laissez-faire was losing out, or whatever, or coming war in Europe. The other one, much more interesting one, which Leland Jaeger, by the way, is convinced of, is that he was murdered by the statists in the Austrian court who didn't want him to take over. I leave that with you for further research, so if you're interested in pursuing Meyerling revisionism. So apparently one of the reasons why Menger sort of lost interest in scholarship, didn't do much in his last 20, 30 years of his life, is because of the death of Crown Prince Rudolf, the end of the Rudolf experiment, so to speak. To set the stage of the revolution Menger effected, indeed, and Menger and Böhm-Bawerk, the Austrian Revolution, is that he was reacting against, of course, the historical school, which was dominant in German-speaking countries, headed by Gustav Schmoller, who believed there were no economic laws, partly because he was interested in building up the state power in Prussia and the rest of Germany, and then it was inconvenient to have any economic laws out there which might contradict or could confound government decrees and actions. As a matter of fact, the famous phrase of Schmoller, which Mises like to mention from time to time, is the function of the University of Berlin, which of course the creation of the Prussian state. The function of the professors of the University of Berlin is to form the intellectual bodyguard of the House of Hohenzollern, the dynastic Prussian monarchy. And when Menger's Principles of Economics was published, it was greeted with hatred and of course, bitter derision and hatred by the Schmollerites, who began to organize a cadre campaign against it. And then Menger got caught up in this methodological conflict, explaining why there is such a thing as economic law and why it's not just historical bound and all the rest of it. What Menger did in this Principles is really revive the continental tradition, the scholastic economic tradition of Catalan and Turgot in the 18th century France, the tradition, of course, of subjective value theory, of individual action, of really praxeological work, focus of on individual action and individual expectations and acting through time. And in fact, of course, the consumers valuing the good determine the price of the good and also determine the value of the factors of production. So the whole basic outlines of Austrian doctrine were in Menger's Principles. They weren't fully worked out, but they were sort of in there. They were essentially a revival and a development of the scholastic, medieval, late Spanish scholastic and 18th century French tradition. Well, there was, as I say, there's the fight in Germany, German-speaking countries. There was the fight with the Schmollerites. In England, of course, there was classical economics, which the Austrians never really grappled with too much because they're much more concerned with grappling with Schmoller. It's kind of a sweet thing that happened with me in the seminar. The one time we really had an argument. It was a very friendly argument. We were arguing about my deviation. One of my major deviations from Mises was on monopoly theory. And I was claiming there's no such thing as monopoly on the free market. Anyway, so the discussion ended when he accused me of being a Schmollerite. The interesting thing is that nobody else in the room, I think, understood what he was talking about. Understood this was the ultimate insult an Austrian could level at a critic. So the Austrians never really came to grapple with the English classical tradition, understood where they stood in relation to it. After all, England was far away. They were fighting with the German situation. The English classical school, and my vision, as Schumpeter would call it, my vision of the history of economic thought, is that the English classical school was the great detour, the great diversion from the mainline scholastic French tradition. The scholastic French tradition was a classic dash French tradition. Continental tradition was a subjective value theory. It was basically what I call pre-Austrian. I realize it's anachronistic to say it. That's really what it was. With Adam Smith and with Smith and Ricardo, we have and the middle themes and John Stewart, we have a tremendous shift toward a new kind of theory which still plagues us, of course, in the present day, namely that the real determinant of value of values and prices of goods is not subjective utility, but objective labor pain, labor toil, whatever you want to call it. And this was established, basically Smith and Ricardo, and it then fell out of favor in England and was restored by John Stuart Mill in a tremendous act of filial pietism, paying his great debt to his father, and by sheer intellectual bravura and the fact that he had tremendous stature in England at that time, won the day again, restored Ricardianism to its unfortunate place in the history of thought. So when Menger created the Austrian theory, the standard discussion since that of marginalism until very, very recently, of course, the standard discussion history of thought books was, marginalism popped up independent in three countries: Menger in Austria, Jevons in England, and Valois in Switzerland. And all basically the same. And so the basic view of the history of thought, and as I said, until very recently was, they're all about the same. All Menger, Jevons, and Valois, except that Menger didn't know math. Menger was inferior if he didn't understand mathematics. Therefore, we should concentrate on Jevons and Valois. Of course, Valois has really taken over modern microeconomics. If you read, for example, one of the most repellent and odious works written on Böhm-Bawerk by Stigler, George Stigler, his PhD dissertation called Production Distribution Theories, where he has a chapter on Menger and a chapter on Böhm-Bawerk. He didn't like Menger, but he hated Böhm-Bawerk. All bad people hate Böhm-Bawerk. He used to be a he. And what he said about Böhm-Bawerk, he said he didn't understand mathematics. Basically, that's it. Unfortunately, these guys did understand, both Menger and Böhm-Bawerk were trained in mathematics. They understood it all too well, which is why they rejected it. This, of course, the idea of knowing mathematics and rejecting its application in economics does not even occur to the mathematical economists. It's just outside their ken. An unthinkable thought. Well, then what happens? Well, Austrian economics, even though this was the official view, so to speak, Austrian economics was extremely influential in the United States, with Fetter Fetter is very important Austrian, Davenport, Green. These were important Austrians who ignored the British classical tradition or attacked it. Unfortunately, what happened in the United States was, in World War I, something snapped in American academic economics, and theory drops out. Institutionalists take over. Except for a few people here and there, Fisher and Knight, who were unfortunate sort of pre-monetarist types, pre-Chicagoite. Fetter lost interest in economic theory, more or less, and got hung up on monopoly, basing point monopoly, which he spent the rest of his life on. So, unfortunately, this left a vacuum, and institutionalism poured in. So the American, a dumb variant of the Schmoller historical school. I mean, it's a historical school people with no knowledge of history or social science or anything. So these are the guys who sort of took over academic economics and left a theoretical vacuum in American economics. Well, this meant that in England, which of course was the revered home of economics, supposedly, what happened in England was that the Austrian contribution, in this case Jevons and the Austrian contribution, was very cleverly and cunningly trivialized by Alfred Marshall, his mighty work, The Principles of Economics, and disposed of it that way by trivializing it. And from then on, Austrian school was not considered, not even mentioned, thought of by English economists, by Cambridge economists, or by anybody else in the English tradition. And I grew up, I cut my eye teeth on Marshall. We had a very interesting college seminar, senior seminar. We spent the entire year on Marshall, going through every chapter. And it was very interesting. So I recommend it if especially if there's nothing else to read. Certainly better than Keynes. But it was very interesting because that was considered economics. And what he did with marginal utility theories, he trivialized. He said, well, it applies. It's interesting. It fills a gap in the Ricardian program because Ricardo really didn't consider consumers, and sort of explains consumer demand. That's it. Then we finish it off. Because, of course, as you know, the famous Marshallian scissors, every price is determined partly by demand, that's the demand blade, and the supply blade, or the cost blade. Of course, the really important thing is the cost blade, because that's the long run, the real gutsy thing, the equilibrium thing. Whereas consumers are sort of, they're sort of the creatures of caprice and whim, and they change their minds all the time, the hell of it. And so the really important thing about economics is the cost. And the real important thing about cost, of course, is labor pain, or back to Ricardo and Marx and all the rest of it. It was a very clever device that he used. You can't say he ignored marginal utility, he just trivialized it. Encapsulated in a couple of appendices or whatever, and that was it. I remember when I was taking history of sport at Columbia. Those days, the Columbia Graduate School was very high, top department, no question about it. Had not fallen to its present sorry state, ranked him among the top 3 graduate schools. And my professor was J.M. Clark, a revered figure. I asked him, I said, well, I didn't know anything about Austrian. I asked him about Jevons. And then Jevons was some point. Yeah, I know how to read Jevons. He said, it's all incorporated as a Marshall. I'm sure if I had known about Austrians, he would have said the same thing about that. So that shoves everything aside. Marshall then takes care of everything else. And this was before the Keynesian takeover. This is the Marshallian takeover. Of course, the Keynesian takeover is really part of that. In a larger sense, since Keynes was Marshall's student. So, all right, to sum up Menger very quickly, now, what did he contribute? Again, he essentially brought back or developed the scholastic tradition, the praxeological method, the focus on individual action, entrepreneurship. All this comes in, of course. Time, structure of production, the focus on individual, the fact that individual values of our consumer our expected values of consumers determine the value of the factors of production entrepreneurs are willing to invest in. The whole Austrian framework. If you read Menger, you know you're reading an Austrian book. That reads differently. Austrian books read differently, look differently, smell different than neoclassical books. One thing is no math in them, very little. But it's also, they're clear, they're logical, they proceed step by step. There's no sort of sudden flights of abstract fancy, not grounded in actual individual action. But what about Böhm-Bawerk? What Böhm-Bawerk did was he developed this outline, which Menger contributed. In particular, developed the value theory, developed the value and price theory, very important, this famous marginal pairs, the horses, you know about the horses, the first horse and the second horse and all that, developed the law of diminishing marginal utility brilliantly, and of course developed the entire capital interest theory. He was the one who rescued capital interest theory from neglect. And as I said, always was considered that Böhm-Bawerk was the mainline Mengerian. And It's only the last 10 years or so when Böhm-Bawerk has been deprecated by Losmanians and other people saying, no, Böhm-Bawerk is an evil Ricardian. And Menger was the only true Austrian. I think it's a current fancy which has been developed. I don't think anybody before that ever thought that, including Menger or Böhm-Bawerk. Now, there are attempts, Erich Streissler, for example, has attempted to say, no, there are tremendous differences between Menger and Böhm-Bawerk. Menger, for example, when he retired his chair in Vienna, conferred the chair upon, there's only one person can hold a chair at one time. He conferred it upon Wieser. Presumably liked Wieser better. It still doesn't really establish much. But he said various things like he didn't like Böhm-Bawerk's capital theory. Terrible mistake. Okay, terrible mistake. So what does that mean? The Streissler view is that, he's written several articles on this, is that, he said that it means that he didn't believe there is such a thing as he believed in time preference. We know that. We know Menger said that time preference was important. But somehow he didn't believe the time preference was reflected in the rate of interest. There was no rate of interest. It's too much of an equilibrating thing. Only 2,000 rates of interest around. There's no one rate of interest. There's no tendency toward it. Well, that's possible. I don't believe it. I frankly don't believe it. I don't think Menger rejected equilibration. Kirzner, in a very interesting article in the Atlantic Economic Journal about 8 years ago, so he's had a whole issue on Menger. He's a very subtle article, it's a typical Kirzerian article, very subtle. I mean, he's one of the most understated economists I've ever read. You have to read him with great care, and it's pretty obvious that he's refuting this idea that there's a big split between Menger and Böhm-Bawerk, and that they're really fairly similar. Now, if you look at Böhm-Bawerk himself, what does he say about Menger? He doesn't say that Menger doesn't believe in a rate of interest. He says that Menger believes in a rate of interest, but it's incorrect. Böhm-Bawerk said, by the way, I recommend Böhm-Bawerk highly. He's one of the great, I love reading Böhm-Bawerk. He's great, one of the great, probably the great polemicists in the history of the economic thought. Sits down with different economists and very patiently, paragraph by paragraph, page by page, demolishes them in a very polite manner. So left as rubble. And what he does with Menger, he's very respectful of Menger. Menger's a great guy, except for great insights. However, unfortunately, he's got an incorrect theory of interest. This theory of interest is the so-called use theory. But somehow, and he explains it very, very usual brilliant and lucid manner, that Menger somehow believe that when you buy capital goods, when you buy factors of production, there's also an you pay a price for them, as Roger said today. But you're also doing something else. You're also paying an extra surplus for the use of the factors of production, for the disposing of the factors of production. And Böhm-Bawerk very carefully, page after page, says, look, there's no difference between the use of something and the thing itself. When you buy something, you buy the uses of them. That's the whole point. You buy a machine, you buy all the uses of the machine. There's no extra use payment in addition to the payment of the machine. Very beautifully and lucidly and carefully, he demolishes Menger. Obviously, Menger doesn't like to be demolished. There are very few people in the history of social thought who love being demolished. There might be one or two here and there, but I don't know of them. Okay, and I think that's it. I don't think the argument was over equilibration. I think the argument was over use theory. And Böhm-Bawerk, of course, brings in the time preference theory of interest. And somebody asked Roger, why did Böhm-Bawerk reintroduce it? I really don't know that. It's a famous puzzle in history of thought. Böhm-Bawerk's Volume 1, Capital Interest, is a total demolition of the productivity theory. My only quarrel with Böhm-Bawerk is a little unfair. He's unfair to Turgot. No question about that. What he does is his strategy was, here he's writing the definitive interest theory, capital interest theory. He started by smashing everybody before you. Well, it's kind of lovable. On the other hand, once in a while, he's unfair to people. Because Turgot really had the whole Austrian theory encapsulated. And we know that Böhm-Bawerk, much as I revere Böhm-Bawerk and love him, unfortunately, we know that he lied about Turgot, because we know that there's an unpublished manuscript of Böhm-Bawerk's written about 8 years before his book came out in the seminar of Karl Knies on Turgot's theory of interest. And he said there that he hails Turgot's theory of interest as great and wonderful and so forth and so on. When he gets 8 years later to publish the book, he dismisses it as physiocratic nonsense about land fructification. So something happened there, something in the 8 years. And I think it just didn't fit his strategy, so to speak. At any rate, this unpublished work, which I'd love to see translated and published someday, is in the possession of F.A. Hayek. Böhm-Bawerk's widow gave it to Hayek, young Hayek, in 1919 or something. It's still somewhere in Hayek's repository. That's another research project for you. So Böhm-Bawerk then establishes the time preference theory and beautifully demolishes. There's no extra surplus. There's a difference between the productivity of capital goods is the reason why there's a price of capital goods. The interest payment is the time discount. And for some strange, crazy reason, in his Volume 2, he brings it back. Not only does he bring back productivity, he makes it the most important element. So it's a total contradiction between his Volume 1 and Volumes 2 and 3. And Frank Fetter's contribution was to demolish Böhm-Bawerk in turn, saying this doesn't work, and to establish the so-called pure time for. The reason why we call it pure is because there's been all these admixtures, impure admixtures of productivity theory and all sorts of other stuff. We're trying to distill the pure causal factor. A couple of famous problems with Böhm-Bawerk, alleged problems. Again, I think the reason why Böhm-Bawerk has been particularly attacked by the nihilist forces in modern Austrian economics is because he's obviously clear, it's obviously equilibrating, it's obviously part of a great economic tradition. It's also what Mises built his theory on. Obviously, Mises is an elaboration of Böhm-Bawerk, an application to money, theory of money. So if you eliminate Böhm-Bawerk, you're also implicitly eliminating Mises. So cut the ground out from under Mises. It's a strategic ploy on the part of the nihilist forces. I mean, the thing is about the nihilists, if they don't like Mises, they don't like Böhm-Bawerk, who are they going to like if they call themselves Austrian? There's only Menger is the only one left. He's far enough in the past to sort of be safe, I suppose. One alleged problem with Böhm-Bawerk always comes up, so I will talk about that, is why is it that an increased saving and investment always lengthens the structure of production? Why is it always a more roundabout production process? Why can't it be in a short production process? And the answer is very simple. It says, I like to call it, have a little grid here, 2x2 grid. This, of course, is simplifying the picture, but I think you'll see the story here. Here we have production processes, less productive and more productive. I mean, in reality, of course, there's a whole spectrum of productivity. I'm making it a 2x2 grid here. And here we have shorter, in other words, coming early, and longer. Well, if a process is very short, if it takes like 5 minutes, and very productive, it's going to be used already. It's not a problem. It's like manna dropping from heaven. If you have manna dropping from heaven, or the shmoo, if you remember the early Al Cap, the shmoo is infinitely productive. It can be used for anything. Well, obviously, you're going to snap it up. I mean, it's already going to be used. So that is no longer a part of human action. It's whatever is there has already been used up. Okay. On the other hand, if a process is very long and produces almost nothing, it's not going to be used at all. Only morons would use it. I mean, in other words, if it takes you 50 years to produce one widget, you're not going to do it if you know it, if you have any brains at all. So this is out of the picture too. So you toss out the long, unproductive processes and the short, very productive processes. You're left with two things. You're left with short, less productive processes versus longer, more productive. And so when you save and invest, you decide what you're going to give up early consumption and up for longer but more productive process. So that's why more saving investment is always a longer process of production. It's very simple if you look at this grid work. And of course, he's got the time structure of production, wonderful analysis of capital and interest. Another thing I should say about Menger and Böhm-Bawerk and the milieu they were involved in, it's not an accident. I think it's Emil Kauder, I think, was the first one to analyze this and to point this out. And I think he's actually on the ball, is that it's no accident that the value climate, the epistemological value and value climate in Austria is completely different than it was in Germany and Britain. Namely, in short, Austria was Catholic and always had been Catholic, whereas northern Germany was Protestant, and England, of course, was Protestant. And what this meant in epistemological and value terms is that in Austria, they still continued to read Aristotle in the high schools till very late. Certainly by the time Menger and Böhm-Bawerk were growing up. They were steeped in natural law, natural rights, and Aristotelian epistemology in general. Northern Germany and England and Britain were influenced by Calvinism and Protestant evangelicalism, which tossed out the so-called scholastic method. And in addition to that, of course, Aristotle was not read. Hegel, of course, was Protestant or some form of Protestant. So we have the Austrians steeped in a very different tradition, religious and philosophical tradition, than either the Germans or the British. And the new book edited by Barry Smith, the very interesting thing about that is he points out his best article there is one by Smith himself on the philosophical climate of Austrian economics. He points out not just that they were reading Aristotle, but the big philosopher of Austria was Franz Brentano, who was an Aristotelian realist, the lead guy I read all the time, all over the place in Austria. And also points out that Menger's principle, he has paragraphs from Menger and paragraphs from Brentano showing almost identical in their basic epistemology. A view of natural law, a view of essences of so-called exact law, the essences of action, the connected cause and effect. All these things very close to Brentano. They knew each other, by the way. They interacted a lot. Their value theories were quite similar, too. The subjective value theory of Brentano was quite similar to that of Menger. So the tremendous interaction between Menger and Böhm-Bawerk people on the one hand and the Brentano people on the other. In Britain, you had an even worse situation from my point of view. And then you have Calvinism rampant, which was, first of all, dominant in Adam Smith. I don't think it's an accident Adam Smith tossed out short-run consumer value. He knew about subjective utility because in consumer subjective value theory, because he knew Turgot, he was a friend of his, and he read this stuff. But Smith, being a Calvinist, could not believe that you could rely on consumers could actually have any dominance at all. Consumers were fickle, and they spent a lot, and they believe in luxury expenditures. They're obviously sinful anyway. The real core determinant was thrift and industry, hard work and thrift. And so we have in Smith a bias toward thrift, desire to tax consumption heavily, for example, and to stimulate, have usury laws to channel saving into productive investment. And also the emphasis, of course, on labor of pain as the real basis of value. It's true that Ricardo was not Calvinist, but James Mill, who was Ricardo's control, that's a strong term, but I think more and more believe James Mill was the real heart of Ricardianism. James Mill was a Scottish Calvinist and imbibed the whole doctrines of Scotland, came to England, and then continued it. John Stuart Mill, of course, was his father, a very peculiar relationship with his father. And the only place where Freudianism might have some kind of truth value, I think, is the Mill father-son relationship. Very weird situation. Anyway, John Stuart Mill reestablishing this whole doctrine. And with Marshall, interesting enough, if you read Marshall, there's Calvinist moralism constantly throughout. I mean, here he is, this allegedly value-free scientist talking about demand curves and all that. They're always constantly shoving in stuff about the importance of thrift and all that sort of stuff. There's sort of a neo-Calvinism redolent throughout the book. And I don't think it's an accident that people who are neo-Calvinist types don't like to talk about consumers, because consumers are fickle and they spend and they're luxurious and they're sinful anyway. Whereas pain and hard work and thrift is really good stuff. I don't know of any labor theory of value person who was not brought up in the British tradition. Marx, of course, with economic labor was Ricardian. I think Böhm-Bawerk, despite his peccadillos and bringing back productivity, the key person in the development of theory of capital interest, I recommend reading him. I think he's great. I love the slow, patient demolition of the enemy. It's magnificent. There's promised a reference to Marx in this thing. Maybe I should have recommended some more of these readings, like Barry Smith and stuff. But I just gotten finished with dealing with Marx in my own work, so I just want to inflict the pain on other people. The interesting about Böhm-Bawerk's refutation of Marx, which of course is a famous refutation, which he his review, so to speak, after the theory of interest, he sort of had the basis of it in his theory of capital interest. But after Marx's volume 3 of Capital was put out by Engels, Böhm-Bawerk does the ultimate demolition of it. He was generally accepted by economists of the day. You're right. I mean, and really until this day, Marxist economists are very weak on labor theory of value. They're not labor value theorists. Even Joan Robertson, people like that. Well, of course, we know labor theory is ridiculous, but somehow it's exploitation anyway. But that's really, of course, the guts of the economic aspect of Marxism, and it was essentially demolished by Böhm-Bawerk. Of course, by the way, the famous story here is a true story that in volume 2 of Capital, by this time Marx had died, and Engels was engaged in this great work of coming out with getting Marx's old notes together, getting into a book form. In volume 2 of Capital, in the preface, Engels teasingly, sort of, I think, childishly organized the game. Let's see how the Marx is going to solve a great problem. The great problem, of course, is this, from volume 1 of Capital. If profits come from exploitation of workers and profit rates are reduced, then, of course, whenever there's capital investment, how is it the profit rates are really about the same on the market? So what's the story here? Why isn't it true that the profit rate in, say, heavily capitalized industry is much lower than a profit rate, say, in ditch digging, which should be very high? And he said, well, in volume 3, Marx will solve this great problem. So Engels offered a contest. Let's everybody get to it and see how Marx solved it. See if they can predict how Marx solved it. And a lot of people, engage in this contest. Of course, there's no prize at the end. But at any rate, they came out also says, how could he solve this insoluble problem? In other words, you either have the labor theory value, or you give that up, or you give up the idea that profit rates are equalized on the market. Difficult to the Marxists to give up either one. Anyway, nobody solves it, supposedly, and then it comes out with the alleged solution, which Böhm-Bawerk then riddles patiently point by point, and shows that Marxists essentially implicitly gave up the labor theory value, because he obviously had to admit that profits tend to be equalized on the market, and therefore labor theory value is shot. And of course, Marx doesn't admit it, but he points out he has to admit it, etc., etc. The interesting thing is the reaction. I think many Marxists gave up the thing altogether. Achille Loria, kind of a sweet reaction to all this. Loria was an Italian Marxist. Didn't have to wait for Böhm-Bawerk's critique. He realized immediately when he read volume 3, the whole thing was shot. And he was very bitter because he had previously said that Capital is the greatest book of all time. It's the fulcrum of all life or whatever. When Volume 3 came out, Luria said that this is the Russian campaign of Marx. That was the analogy, of course, in Napoleon's Russian campaign. This is the end, it's suicide. He's had it. Marxism is finished. The other Marxists who try to remain Marxists to this day, what they did is essentially change the terms of the debate. They said, well, Marx didn't mean it when he thought about value. He didn't mean prices. He didn't mean influences on relative price. He meant something else. He meant some kind of mystical embodiment of value. So it has nothing to do with a price system. Of course, Marx thought he had something to do with a price system. This is typical, of course, Marxist reaction to criticism. When predictions are made, when Marx makes a prediction, for example, the workers are going to get worse and worse off until they finally revolt. They're obviously not getting worse and worse off. And Marx's reaction is, well, Marx didn't mean worse off. He meant relatively worse off to wealthier people. You shift the terms of the debate. You never be wrong. It's a non-falsifiable proposition. So the Marxist reaction laws, those who continue to be Marxists, well, Marx didn't mean, he meant values in some sort of mystical sense. The values were embodied by labor. It has nothing to do with prices. Marx, I don't think, meant that. But this is the fallback position. This is the position of Hilferding, for you have a so-called refutation of Böhm-Bawerk. Mises tells the story about Otto Bauer, who was the leading Austrian Marxist for many years, a friend of Mises, at least for a while. And Bauer enrolled in Böhm-Bawerk's seminar for a couple of years in order to refute it, in order to refute Böhm-Bawerk's refutation of Marx, to be the definitive refutation. He never did it. And he admitted to Mises one time, well, this is it. There's no refutation. The labor theory value is shot. And one interesting thing is, sort of a footnote to this saga, is that the most highly praised recent book on Marxism, which is by Thomas Sowell on Marxism, also takes the Marxist line of Böhm-Bawerk didn't understand Marx and he meant something else. And it's a strange book because Sowell was essentially a pro-Marxist book, which has been billed by propagandists as the definitive critique of Marxism. If I leave that to your, it's kind of interesting saga. There's also a couple of charming quotes by Alexander Gray, my favorite humorous economic writer, historian of economic thought. And he's going through all this stuff. He's a marvelous book called The Socialist Tradition, where he's going through all the socialists. He talks about the attempts of various Marxists to try to explain why Marx didn't really mean value. What did he really mean when he talked about value? He takes off on G.D.H. Cole's book, which is called What Marx Really Meant, and tries to explain this, etc. So here's a charming quote from Gray. See, this is critique of Cole. The identity of value and embodied labor was surely something Marx thought he had proved, which therefore required proof in the opening pages of Capital. If the identity of value and labor is a matter of definition, as the neo-Marxists said, an assumption, then at least we know the meaning Marx attaches to value. But in that case, the pretended proof in the opening chapter is mere eyewash, since one states but does not prove definition. So if the whole thing is simply a definition, well, it's value because I say it is, why does he go through the whole book? Also, in that case, he adds, it is to be feared that the whole of Capital, resting on an arbitrary definition which implies the conclusion to be reached, is an example of wandering vainly in a circle, even more than the most critical critics have thought possible. If, on the other hand, the identity of value and labor is a matter of proof and not of definition, we are still left to grope for the meaning Marx attaches to the word value. To conclude with Ray on Marx's value theory, to witness Böhm-Bawerk or Mr. Joseph, H.W.B. Joseph wrote a book on labor theory, value, and Marx. To witness Böhm-Bawerk or Joseph carving up Marx is but a pedestrian pleasure. For these are but pedestrian writers who are so pedestrian as to clutch at the plain meaning of words, not realizing that what Marx really meant, Cole, has no necessary connection with what Marx undeniably said. To witness Marx surrounded by his friends is, however, a joy of an entirely different order. For it is fairly clear that none of them really knows what Marx really meant. They are even in considerable doubt as to what he was talking about. There are hints that Marx himself did not know what he was doing. In particular, there's no one to tell us what Marx thought he meant by value. And I think that's, I guess that's the last word on Marx, because I think the entire, that's a whole other saga. The entire Marxian canon is essentially a prophetic religious movement of a weird kind. What I'm advocating here is essentially back to Böhm-Bawerk. I'm going to put that on a sloganeering term. Böhm-Bawerk has been denigrated. He essentially fulfilled the Mengerian mission and applied Mengerian Austrian economics to capital and interest, and successfully so, I think. And then Fetter, of course, when we add him to the arrow here, and then Mises. So I think that's basically I want to say in the lecture, and give you a few minutes, but we'll wrap it up now and call for questions. I go. Margaret.
My question is that Böhm-Bawerk was and Mises had a different approach in dealing about governmental bureaucracy. Do I have that needed essentially was more tolerant of
Tolerant?
tolerant of this?
More tolerant bureaucracy? I don't think so. I think we're pretty similar. I mean, Böhm-Bawerk, I should say about Böhm-Bawerk, he was not a pure academic. Menger, too, was a civil servant, a member of parliament. Böhm-Bawerk was a minister of finance. I think Menger was minister of commerce for a few years. Böhm-Bawerk was minister of finance several times. He sort of alternated the seminar, professorship, and minister of finance. He was the one responsible for going to the gold standard, and generally a free market type. I don't think he didn't engage in political economic analysis as much as Mises did. That's basically, I think, in the same area. And another Böhm-Bawerkian mystery is there's no life, of course, there's no biography of Menger, there's no biography of Böhm-Bawerk. Okay, there's another research projects and nothing. One of the Böhm-Bawerk died fairly young. He died immediately after World War I broke out. And the story is he might have committed suicide. Well, Mises thinks he was very depressed because the wars meant the end of Western civilization, as far as he was concerned. And there's also a story he might have committed suicide as a result of that. So that's a whole question about, the whole world was falling apart. Indeed, it was falling apart. Whole classical liberalism and peaceful world, peaceful Europe, and so forth and so on. I think their views are fairly similar. I don't think Böhm-Bawerk didn't have much time spreading much except these 3-volume work and the different editions of it and different various journal articles. So basically, he too is wrapped up in statesmanship. I'm not sure what his theory of bureaucracy was. Again, this is the whole thing. I don't know if there are Böhm-Bawerk papers. Must be Böhm-Bawerk papers somewhere. I'm not sure where they are. Something to be explored. Yeah, fair frame.
A couple of things about Menger. Hayek mentions in his introduction to the principles that Menger was an activist in the Liberal Party. And maybe that'll help give us an indication of his policy.
Well, I'm not sure, but it could be, I guess liberalism was many things. It could be laissez-faire liberalism, or it could be some sort of very moderate. I'm really sure. I say Streissler claimed he was a hardcore laissez-faire liberal.
And a book called The Gold Standard, edited by Lou Rothbard, that brings out Menger's position on the gold standard, which not only favored for because we favored found money, because it limited the expansion of the state.
It's probably true.
But he also his substatus remarks in his book on money. So he is evidently somewhat of a mixed bag in that respect.
Who is the Upbush? The fellow who wrote in the Barry Smith book on Menger's political theory, political views, keeps talking about the Austrian political theorist, the EOTVOS, with a free umlauts. I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but he sounded pretty statist to me. But I'm not, David, you know anything about the Upbush?
Yeah, everybody would believe that they should, the Austrian Empire should maintain its traditional custom, kind of have local control over things. That Eric Vogelweitz was the sort of the Berkeley servant. Actually, he was fairly influential. He didn't have any particular views on the political war, like suggesting that the desirable to maintain the customs of the old regime. Definitely like the Austrian Empire didn't want to have a democratic national. That was fundamental. Very much against national.
For whatever it's worth, remember that point that Slavager made in Vienna that Menger and Rudolph have co-authored anonymous political pamphlets.
Well, that's right.
Very hardcore status, laissez-faire.
That's right.
That Rudolph got exiled to Budapest for.
That's right.
He's
paper. Yeah. Young there, he wrote anonymously, right, or pseudonymously, right? The hidden Menger. That's great.
I wonder if you might say a few words about Wieser and how it is that he got the somewhat odd use, at least for an Austrian, that he did.
Well, he was a Fabian socialist. Wicksteed was also a Fabian, although he certainly doesn't write like one. He writes like hardcore market person. And He also used, he was, I think, perhaps the first one to use the idea of the Pigou idea that since you have a diminishing marginal utility of money, that somehow this means that you should have a progressive income tax to equalize, maximize general social utility. I think the origin of that. I'm not sure how why he deviated or whatever. Then, of course, there's no biography of him either. I don't know. I know Mises in his Notes and Recollections is very bitter about Wieser, and didn't consider he was more valued much at all. As a matter of fact, when Hayek was first introduced himself to Mises, had a letter of recommendation from Wieser, which almost killed Hayek's chances to beat this. Not quite, but was not considered a positive recommendation. So I'm not sure. That's again, it's another. I mean, I read Wieser's Social Economic. Couldn't think much of it. I didn't see much in there of much value.
There's a section in volume 2 of Böhm-Bawerk's work, a section called the Law of Costs, in which he elaborates on the cost projection view of price determination. And he says that it's possible to reconcile this with the demand utility approach.
Oh, yeah.
So you reconcile the backward, looking toward the past price determination with the looking toward the future view.
Well, the costs are looking to the future. The costs are the expected productivity of the factor, to the consumers. So, in other words, the costs are also a subjective concept.
Well,
because people pay for factors of production they think it will bring certain value to the entrepreneur, based on what consumers will pay for, how much will be produced, and what consumers will pay for it.
I didn't think he was using that for cost. I think he was using the classical version of cost as monetary outlet, and I'm not quite sure how he's able to tie them together.
Well, I think I basically think he used this version of cost. I realized that was developed more over time, but I think he was basically an opportunity cost Austrian. And certainly Jevons, to the extent he wrote about it, was. Yeah.
Larry White says that Böhm-Bawerk was distinctly not a praxeologist, and that Mises' work on methodology was to some extent a repudiation of his mentor. Do you think that's much ado about nothing?
Well, why didn't Mises ever say it? Mises was not reluctant to talk about what his views were. There's nothing in Mises that he repudiated from Bawerk, quite the opposite. He always hailed him as his predecessor.
The whole style of the Bawerk's presentation is really logical. It's this kind of logical deduction. Reading his book, it's like he starts from scratch and then builds on things. It's just the Eric style is really ridiculous to think that there's any kind of principal difference between the two, even though Böhm-Bawerk did not write much on methodology. He has some remarks. Their scores are very explicit, but there is no indication.
Yeah, it's a beautiful book from Bawerk. Actually, one of the problems with Bawerk is I realize the Smart translation is the first edition, and so the Zenholz translation is the third edition. But I think I don't know German that well, but I know Smart was a much better writer in English. So the Böhm-Bawerk on the Smart edition is a great writer and just flowed beautifully. So I don't know whether it's the Smart himself or wasn't himself a good writer or whatever, but I would recommend reading that to get the flow of Böhm-Bawerk, step by step, and everything fits together. The Zenholz translation was kind of choppy and wooden. And as a matter of fact, when I talked to Emil Katter about this, who of course read both translations and all the rest of it, the original, he said he thought the Smart translation was better, period. So let's yeah.
Can you briefly explain the difference between Menger, Böhm-Bawerk, and Mises, and Lachmann's notion of capital, and how Lachmann's notion of capital and the structure of production leads to a nihilist view?
Well, Lachmann's book, Capital and its Structure, is basically from Böhm-Bawerk Misesian book. It's the early Lachmann. It's Lachmann 1, okay? And that was, that's a fine book. I'm all for it. It talks about how the stock market fits into all this. So the titles to shares of titles to capital fit into the whole structure of allocating resources in the best manner, etc. So that's a great book. That's essentially Böhm-Bawerk Misesian book. What happened was Lachmann, sometime after that, discovered Shackle and nihilism, and then became a Shackelian. And so that's, it's Lachmann 2. There's not much you can say about that, except it's institutionalist. It's a nihilist and institutional. There are no economic laws. You can't predict the future. You don't know what's going on. It's all sort of chaotic, or collidic, as Lachmann likes to put it. And that's about it. I mean, that's kind of a boring thing in a sense. Even, I mean, even if it were true, it would be boring. It's of course false, but it's really about all you can say is everything is collidic and period, and you sort of wipe out all of economics. But I don't see much. I think Böhm-Bawerk is definitely, he's more the Misesian praxeological tradition than Menger in a sense of step-by-step analysis and everything flowing logically from the axioms. Yeah, Roger.
Murray, earlier you said that he thought or the Böhm-Bawerk was unfair to Turgot. Would you say something similar to that about his treatment of Schisel and the notion of waiting and all that was?
I don't know. I haven't really focused on it. I know Schisel was sort of aggregativist type, of a Fisher type, but and also didn't have the sort of the array view of price index view, etc. He might have been. He was. You can't. As I say, he had this idea that everybody before him has to be demolished, and once in a while demolishing something unfairly. And it might be the only one he didn't do that with John Ray. But of course, John Ray was discovered after he wrote his first edition, and in 1903 or whatever, he came out with the edition. Then he hails John Ray as a great predecessor. So by that time, he sort of established a strategy for the first volume. So it might be unfair. You can't, it's sort of you have to go back and check it. Yeah.
If the paper favorable to Turgot is still in Hayek's basement, well, how is it known that Böhm-Bawerk was so favorable in the beginning?
Because Hayek discloses what he said. No, Hayek reported this, that he hails Turgot's interest theories and predecessor of his own work. So that's something else. It's in the Turgot edition. The marvelous English translation of all of Turgot's economics works by Groenewegen. He's got that in there, reporting this from Hayek. So I could see Hayek disgorge this or his state or whatever, and get a translator or whatever. It should be fascinating. Sure. Yeah.
When my sake, it'd be nothing else on Menger and Rothbard. I think you're being a little unfair to Tom Sowell's book about Marxism. I think that the Sowell point about Marx and the labor definition of value. In fact, I think Tom states specifically in this book that Marx did not give a labor theory of value. He gave a labor definition of value. And this is a bit of controversy. And given that Marx is, in many cases, not sufficiently coherent to be termed right or wrong, I think that you are being a little bit unfair to him.
I think I'm being not unfair enough because he says about Marx. He says that these other guys never cite Marx directly, Samuelson and so forth. And he said Marx never has a labor theory. It doesn't mention the word labor theory of value. And of course he did. And there's a review of David Ramsey Steele on International Philosophical Quarterly points that out. This nails Sowell to the wall, and this points out it's right in there and quotes it. And so I think that's he does other things like that too. He's very arrogant. I mean, so it's bad enough to be arrogant when you're justified. It's I think very bad to be arrogant when it's not justified at all. Because I think that's the situation with Sowell. And I think the Conway book is infinitely better as an introduction to Marx than Sowell is. I think what happened in Sowell, if you read the Sowell book carefully, you'll find out that the citations almost all about before 1963. So it's pretty clear he wrote that this is a collection of his notes written when he was a Marxist. So, and just simply put together, and you add on an anti-Stalinist chapter, and that's about it. I think that's the inception of a book. This is annual book. This is his contribution last year. Yeah, Roger.
With modern Marxists, do they tend to defend this labor theory of value or reject it? It seems like there's a big problem either way.
Yeah.
If they defend it, then predictably they'll say very silly things. But if they reject it, then they're just that thing without rudder. There's everything collapsing.
Basically, they tend to reject it. I don't know. Beats me.
The overall social philosophy.
Yeah, class struggle.
Notion of mankind through the stages of feudalism, imperialism, socialism, right? All the rest of that they try to rescue, but there are, to my knowledge, there's hardly any Marxist who would defend the labor theory of value, even though they all recognize that is the core of Marxism.
Well, there was one at NYU. I can't think of his name.
Becker.
Becker.
Yeah.
Now he proudly defended the labor theory of value.
Yeah. pretty few and far between.
Neat, but I can't remember what he said.
Yeah.
It's involved harder to know it.
Yeah. Now, basically, they fall back on general sociology or whatever. Alienation, of course, is a big one. And the labor theory of value gets shunted aside somewhere. But it's interesting because Marxism tends to flourish not in economics, but in other softer disciplines, literature, sociology, all these benighted areas where they flourish. But in economics is really fairly free of it.
I think that's been imagined and all.
Is it?
I think that's been imagined.
Yeah, but even in the communist countries, the leading forces giving up Marxism have been the economists, in Yugoslavia and Hungary, etc. Always in the forefront of abandoning the whole damn thing and going on as some sort of market.
In Germany, I would say that too. Among economists, you don't find Marxists. I mean, not Marxist in the sense that they think that is the philosophy that they use as their guideline or whatever. You find among sociologists, political science, or German, English, literature. You name it, you got it. But in economics, outright Marxist is a rare occasion.
It's a toughie. Independent. There's something about the discipline of economics, I think, that sort of puts a conservatizing influence in general. The fact that you can't eat your cake and have it at the same time is sort of self-discipline.
Yeah.
Yeah, that too. Yeah. Yeah.
We're really on the topic, but since we're on it, why don't you tell us a little bit about since you just finished your work on Marx?
Oh yeah.
To give us a little précis of your view of Marx.
Yeah. Okay. What happened to me is I set out to write a short book on history of economic thought, and it's got longer and longer and longer because I can't leave out good guys, I can't leave out bad guys, and I find more and more good guys and bad guys all over the place. In the case of Marx, I thought, well, everybody knows about Marx, labor theory of value, and bingo. I found out, of course, there's a lot more to it. And I had to plow my way to Hegel, which is something I do not wish on my worst foes. At any rate, what I think the essence of Marx is worse than we might think. In other words, the whole thing is really a religious doctrine. It comes from, it starts off with the Christian heresy, and actually Neoplatonic movement, Christian heresies in the early Christian period. It continues on. It was sort of an underground movement, the basis of which, well, the two aspects of it. One is creatology, the science of how the universe was created, or why did God create the universe. This might seem to many here as an esoteric topic, okay? But interesting enough, it's something like praxeology. Theology, I find, is very interesting. It's something like praxeology. One slip and you've had it. One slip, you've had the deductive chain. You make one slip somewhere in the early premises and you're sort of finished. You wind up with bizarre deviations. So it happens, the Orthodox Christian view, which is a safe view, by the way, in all these areas, as far as I can see. The Orthodox Christian view is God created the universe out of love for his creatures. And there's no political implications or sociological implications from this. The heretical view was that God created the universe because God was dissatisfied, was unlonely, or whatever you want, imperfect. Okay, so you start off with the viewpoint, which starts with, say, with Plotinus, and the Neoplatonists goes down, is that you start with the world where God and man are unified. Now, how man and God could be unified before creation, I don't know. Don't ask me to explain this. I can only report it. Okay. So God and man are sort of together one cosmic blob, but unfulfilled, imperfect. Then God creates the universe as an act of desperation to try to fulfill God's functions or soul, whatever. And then you have creation. A creation becomes then, because heretical Christian heresy view, an act of evil, because what you have is you split the original unity of man and God. Before that, man, God, and nature, before creation, were unified. That was the great thing about it. Then, with the creation of the universe, everything gets split into atoms and individuals and species and all the rest of it. So man, with a collective capital M, of course, the species, is now cut off from nature and cut off from God. Okay? And once individual men are cut off from each other because they're really a part of a collective blob. So, at this point, the good thing, the bad thing about it is this is where the concept of alienation comes in. Alienation does not mean psychological disturbance because you don't like what's going on or something like that. Alienation is a fundamental act of creation involved in creation itself. Man, God, and nature are alienated from each other. Okay, so then what happens is a determined process by which God fulfills himself in some way, man fulfills himself, and a species development, and finally, as an ultimate act, the final end of the universe, eschatology, the last days, where man and God rejoin each other in a great blob again, at this time at a higher level. Known as the return. Now this, whatever we want to say about this, is very collectivist, okay? Because the individual means nothing. The individual person is nothing, just a cell in this great collective organism. And so when you say man is progressing, it means the species is progressing toward this higher level and an ultimate reunion with God. Okay? What happens though, then later as things develop, okay, with this after the Christian period, Middle Ages, etc., this gets pantheized with Hegel. The entire Romantic period as a pantheization of this. God drops out as a supernatural person or being or whatever, and you have what you're left with is collective man, the species, then finding out that man and God are really the same thing, and that's the ultimate consciousness. After you wind up with a cosmic blob, this time God has dropped out. Man and God are the same thing. You have a sort of a pantheistic thing. All is one. Okay, this is the end of history, the end of the universe. And the entire Romantic period, by the way, is saturated with this crap. And there's a wonderful book by M.H. Abrams, which I recommend everybody, called Natural Supernaturalism, which is, and analyzes all of Romantic literature and philosophy, basically. Wordsworth and Coleridge and Hegel and Schleiermacher and Schlegel and Schiller and all these people, mostly German and English. They all have this viewpoint, more or less. Down to D.H. Lawrence, by the way. Idea that they have this species development winding up of the end of alienation, and everything is great and perfect as the end of history, as the man is reintegrated with nature and gone, and the rest of it. So what you have with Marx is an atheist version of this pantheism. Hegel was a pantheist. Hegel, of course, believing he himself was the final culmination. He was the ultimate God person because he invented the theory. Okay? So this makes him sort of the world historical figure. And Marx atheized it. See, instead of talking about God at all, you just have a collective species blob man with a capital M. So what you have is the final eschatology, of course, is the communist system where everything is then integrated. All individuals are joined together in a collective blob, which results in the end of history. So it's sort of an atheized version of the pantheized version of original Christian heresy or Neoplatonic heresy. And you have the apocalyptic, the final conflict, where all these things, of course, there's a final conflict with good and evil, or good triumphs over evil, and you have the final, it puts an end to history. All this thing that makes, I wouldn't say it makes sense out of Marx. You understand what the heck he's talking about. He was involved in this kind of a prophet of this doctrine. If you look at his early poems, so-called early poems, even more interesting. Early poems does not mean he was a kid of 12. Okay, he was a graduate student. I figure if you're a graduate student, you're responsible for your own product, right? He wrote these very interesting poems, which have been translated, most of them, and plays, which really hair-raising, because he essentially sets forth his program. This is before he knew about the labor theory value, right? This is when his ultimate sort of vision of the world. The vision of the world was, and what he said was, explicitly was, he hates the universe because God created it. It means that God's a greater person than he is. Therefore, his goal is to destroy the universe. This, of course, fits in with the rest of his program. So anyway, it's a fascinating study. And how can I leave this stuff out, right? As the book keeps growing and growing. Anyway, it's a sort of a encapsulated version of the Marxian review, the Marxian vision. And of course, first and this is of course accepted, he becomes a communist. And then he looks around for, in other words, becomes a communist. Communism is the final goal. How do you bring it about? If you have religion, if you have the second coming, or Messiah comes, you have the mechanism. Of course, Marx couldn't talk about a Messiah. So what's going to be, you have to have some inevitable law of history that determines the final outcome. The rest of his life, he's searching for the economic forces. How does this work? Why does capitalism inevitably lead to communism? The final apocalyptic moment when the working class takes over. He's trying to find the mechanism. So for the last 30 years of his life or whatever, he's trying to figure out how it must work. But the goal of communism was established from very early, 1844 or whatever. And the rest of us kind of spin out how the messianic age is going to take place without the Messiah. It's difficult to do it, and I guess he tried nobly, or whatever you want to call it, and flopped. Anyways, sort of a capsule view of it, yeah. What's the Marxist view, yeah. And by the way, some good books on this. The Tucker book is the best book. It's extremely difficult reading. It's Robert C. Tucker. It's called The Philosophy and Myth and Karl Marx. And it's almost as difficult reading as Marx himself or Hegel, but it's worth it. And he's really got most of this in there. Other books, Bruce Maslow's book, which is in paperback, on meaning of Karl Marx, was in it? I was quite good. I was surprised that Maslow is usually a Freudian historian. This time he's really played it straight, talked about the religious prophetic. So we have now more stuff which is pretty good on all this, analyzing it, and we've more or less transcended the idea of the early Marx and the late Marx. There's one Marx, one bad guy, okay, and starting out with the communism and destruction eschatology and trying to figure out how to work it. And interesting enough, the idea there were two Marxes, the humanist type said, yes, the early Marx is great because the early Marx talks about freedom and alienation. Then he gets bad because he talks about labor theory of value and economics, too rational. So this is the new left Marxists. And then you have the Stalinists, like Althusser, who said, no, the early Marx is crazy. The late Marx is great because he's talking about economics. And of course, the conclusion is there's only one Marx, and it's all different aspects of the same galoot. Yeah. Yeah.
Doesn't Soul in his book uphold this young Marx old?
I think so. He doesn't even talk about the philosophic aspect much at all. I think he does, yeah.
I think I missed a minute ago. Where does Soul go wrong? What are the claims that Soul make there?
Well, I mean, he thinks that Böhm-Bawerk did not refute Marxian, that Böhm-Bawerk didn't understand Marx, and that Marx didn't talk about prices and things like that. And he doesn't really deal with much of any of this. So it's a weak book. Conway, on the other hand, is quite good. I mean, it's not perfect. I think deals with most of the problems. Not so much of the religion aspect, but
Or I think we're arguing where David Ramble Steele on the
but it's a short review. He has the quote. I mean, what is this? Let's see here.
Where did this feel be? Here, I haven't.
International Philosophical Quarterly. Let's see what the issue was. It's June 1986, International Philosophical Quarterly. And so it could be longer, but it's a short review. It really spears them. What Sola said was that Marx nowhere refers to a theory of value, despite a numerous and undocumented interpretive literature to the contrary. What Steele pointed out is there it is. I mean, he cited the exact quotes. So that was just one feature of it. I'm sure Steele, if necessary, could work out a whole thing there. He'll have a lot to say about the Soul book, one of his bête noirs. So
David wasn't a Marx.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Mark.
I have a couple questions. Before Marx became a Hegelian, what was he doing? I understand he was a fairly big classical economist.
Yeah, he wasn't interested in economics. His first wrote poems about destroying the universe. That was the first step, and then he became Hegelian. Okay, and economics really comes in much later when he's trying to figure out, what the path is toward the allegedly inevitable communism.
Another question is, I've heard, I can't remember where, a number of times that Capital was really written by Hegel, and then Marx
Written by Hegel?
had Marx his name on it. What date?
Yeah, Engels. You mean Engels? Yeah, I don't know about that. I mean, I don't know. It's interesting. Gary North has written a second edition of his book on Marxism, Religion and Revolution, cool, right? And Gary North claims that Engels really did most of the work. He was a theorist, and he revered Marx because Marx had a PhD, and Engels didn't. The early case of PhD-itis. I'm not sure about that. It's interesting speculation. There's various views of it. Engels really was a real theorist. There's other views. Engels was the bad guy, as the view of the 50s or so. That Engels was a Stalinist, quote unquote. I'm not really sure. I mean, it needs more investigation if one is interested in investigating it, because the two are very close. They kept while Marx was alive, he read everything Engels wrote, and whatever. So it's sort of like a joint product. Also, there's a tendency to whitewash Marx by saying Engels is the bad guy. For example, the dialectical materialism question, is a part of Marxism that Marxists don't like to talk about, because the idea that dialectical materialism applies to all of life, the cell negates the cell and all that sort of stuff. It doesn't sit well with most people. So the theory is, well, Engels is the guy who's interested in Darwin and biology and things like that. Marx wasn't. Turns out Marx was just as interested. So I don't know. It's interesting area of speculation.
As well, I think Marx sent his work.
He asked Darwin if he would be allowed to dedicate
right.
work to him,
Right.
but Darwin never replied. I'm not quite sure what it, but at least he didn't agree.
Yeah.
And so Marx was
Economics from his father-in-law.
Apparently from Westbourne.
no
I don't think so.
I never heard.
Yeah.
He liked his father-in-law very much. He,
Yeah.
as a, I met they both had a very close relationship, and
Yeah.
that was the explanation why, in spite of the fact that the family of Marx's wife was actually opposed to the marriage. The only one out of the family who was in favor of the marriage of Marx to von Westphalen was his father-in-law.
Mm.
All the rest of it, I hated the fact that they were nobility family and all the rest of it, and Marx until the end of his life was very proud of he then married
Oh yeah.
person from nobility.
Oh yeah. His wife have him engraved calling cards, Baroness von Nussbaum.
That's why he also made tremendous efforts to hide that he also had kids, because
Yeah.
if you are married to a wife from nobility, that's not the kind of thing you do to her.
By the way, Gary Ortho is very interesting. One of the contributions of the book is the only place I've seen he goes through the standard of living indexes of what Marx was living on, how much what the purchasing power was. It turns out Marx generally living on a very high income level, supplied to him mostly by Engels, of course, and by his other benefactors. He was always bitching about shortage of money. He always borrowing, never paying back, and so forth. But he lived apparently quite high income level, went through it like water. Then accused everybody else of having a money fetish. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, back there.
Marx is so wrong and not so many things. Why is it so hard to bury him? What's the problem?
Well, I think it's religious. It's a religious movement, and this true believer kind of thing. It's the difficulty then, penetrate the sort of rational argument. And that's basically it. I mean, that does happen, of course. People get converted out of Marxism quite frequently. But I guess a good spot to end the session. Thank you very much.